There is a version of you that does not flinch when life gets hard. A version of you that hears criticism and does not spiral for 3 days. A version of you that gets betrayed, disappointed, or knocked down, and instead of collapsing into anxiety, self-pity, or numbness, stands back up within minutes, not months. That version of you exists. It is not a fantasy. It is not reserved for people who were born tougher, luckier, or less sensitive than you. It is a version of you that has been buried under years of emotional reactivity, learned helplessness, and a nervous system that was never trained to handle pressure. Today, that changes. Most people spend their entire lives being controlled by their emotions instead of controlling them. A rude comment ruins their morning. A single rejection convinces them they are unlovable. A setback at work spirals into a full-blown identity crisis. They call this being sensitive, being a deep feeler, being empathetic. But there is a difference between having emotions and being enslaved by them. Emotional weakness is not a personality trait. It is a pattern, and every pattern can be broken. This is not going to be a soft, feel-good pep talk. This is a rebuild. We are going to look directly at why you became emotionally fragile in the first place, why almost everything you have been taught about mental toughness is incomplete or flat out wrong, and then we are going to install a real system, one used by people who operate under extreme pressure and still stay calm, clear, and in control. By the end of this, you will not just understand mental strength intellectually. You will have a blueprint you can use for the rest of your life. So sit with this for a second. Ask yourself honestly, how much of your life have you handed over to your emotions? How many decisions have you made or failed to make because you were afraid of how you would feel? How many years have you spent reacting instead of choosing? That ends now. Let's begin. One last thing before we go further. Nothing in this audiobook will feel comfortable to hear, and that is by design. Comfort has never built strength in anyone, in any domain, at any point in human history. Muscles grow from resistance. Character grows from difficulty, faced head-on rather than avoided. If a section of what follows makes you defensive, makes you want to pause and argue internally that it does not apply to you, pay close attention to exactly that section, because discomfort of that specific kind is usually a signal, not a coincidence. Chapter 1. The Root of Emotional Weakness. Nobody is born emotionally weak. This is the first thing you need to understand and accept, because if you believe weakness is who you are, you will never do the work required to change it. Emotional weakness is not genetic. It is built, brick by brick, through years of conditioning, environment, and repeated experience. Once you understand how it was built, you can start tearing it down. The first brick is usually laid in childhood. If you grew up in an environment where your emotions were dismissed, mocked, or punished, you learned one of two things. Either you learned to suppress everything and pretend to be fine, which creates a person who explodes later in life because they never processed anything properly, or you learned that expressing distress loudly was the only way to get attention or help, which creates a person who catastrophizes every minor inconvenience because, as a child, exaggeration was the only tool that worked. Neither of these are your fault, but both of them, if left unexamined, will run your adult life on autopilot. The second brick is comfort. This one is uncomfortable to hear, but it needs to be said. Modern life has engineered discomfort almost completely out of daily existence. You do not have to wait for anything. You do not have to sit with boredom, hunger, silence, or friction. The moment something feels difficult, there is a screen, a snack, a scroll, or a distraction, ready to numb it instantly. The problem is that emotional strength is a muscle, and muscles only grow under resistance. If you have spent years avoiding every form of discomfort the instant it appears, your emotional muscle has had zero opportunity to develop. You are not weak because something is wrong with you. You are weak because you have never been forced to be strong. The third brick is the stories you tell yourself about your own emotions. Most people do not just feel an emotion. They immediately attach a story to it that makes the emotion far worse than it needs to be. You feel anxious before a difficult conversation. And instead of simply noticing this is anxiety, you tell yourself, this feeling means something is wrong. This feeling means I am not ready. This feeling means I will fail. The original emotion might last 90 seconds. The story you build on top of it can last for days. This is one of the most important distinctions you will learn in this entire audiobook. Emotions are temporary, chemical, and physiological events. Suffering is what happens when you attach a permanent narrative to a temporary event. The fourth brick, and one of the most overlooked, is identity. At some point, many people who struggle emotionally begin to wear their sensitivity as an identity. They say things like, I am just an anxious person. I have always been an overthinker. I cannot handle confrontation. That is just how I am. The danger here is enormous, because the moment weakness becomes part of your identity, your brain will unconsciously work to protect and prove that identity correct. You will find yourself acting anxious not because the situation truly demands it, but because some part of you needs to remain consistent with the story you have been telling about yourself for years. Breaking free from emotional weakness requires you to stop treating it as who you are and start treating it as something you currently do. A set of trained responses that can be retrained. Understand this clearly. Every time you have collapsed under pressure, shut down during conflict, spiraled after criticism, or let a single bad moment ruin an entire day, you were not revealing a fixed trait. You were running a program built from childhood conditioning, an absence of resistance, unchecked internal narratives, and an identity you unconsciously adopted. Programs can be rewritten. That is exactly what the rest of this audiobook is going to teach you to do. There is a fifth brick worth naming, because it hides in plain sight, and almost nobody identifies it correctly. It is emotional outsourcing. Somewhere along the way, many people learn to hand the responsibility for regulating their own emotional state to other people. A partner is expected to make them feel secure. A friend is expected to talk them down every time they spiral. A boss's approval becomes the difference between a good week and a terrible one. When your emotional stability depends entirely on the behavior of people around you, you have effectively given away the steering wheel of your own nervous system. This is not a moral failing. It is simply what happens when nobody ever teaches you that self-regulation is a skill you are supposed to build for yourself. The good news is that any skill that was outsourced can be reclaimed. And reclaiming it starts the moment you decide that your emotional stability is your job, not someone else's assignment. It also helps to understand this at the level of biology, because it removes a layer of shame that often accompanies emotional struggle. Your brain's primary function is not happiness. It is survival. The amygdala, the small almond-shaped structure responsible for threat detection, cannot distinguish between a genuine life-threatening danger and a socially uncomfortable moment like public criticism or rejection. To your nervous system, both can trigger an almost identical fight, flight, or freeze response, flooding your body with cortisol and adrenaline. This means that when you feel completely overwhelmed by something that, viewed objectively, was not actually dangerous, you are not broken. You are running an ancient survival system that was built for a world of physical predators and is now firing in response to emails, comments, and awkward conversations. Once you understand that the intensity of the reaction is a biological miscalibration rather than proof that something is deeply wrong with you, the entire problem becomes something you can work with rather than something you have to be ashamed of. Chapter 2. The Mental Strength Myth. Before we build anything new, we need to demolish a lie that has quietly ruined more people's progress than almost any other idea in the self-improvement space. The lie is this: mental strength means not feeling anything at all. You have seen this idea everywhere. The stoic figure who never cries, never gets angry, never seems shaken by anything. The business person who claims they have not felt stress in years. The friend who brags about being completely unbothered no matter what happens. This image has been sold to millions of people as the goal, and it has done enormous damage because it is not strength. It is suppression wearing a costume. Suppression is not the absence of emotion. It is the forceful burial of emotion, and buried things do not disappear, they decompose. People who pride themselves on feeling nothing are often the same people who explode without warning, who develop chronic anxiety with no apparent cause, who get sick more often because unprocessed stress lives in the body, or who go completely numb and lose the ability to feel joy along with everything else. You cannot selectively shut off pain without also shutting off pleasure, connection, and meaning. The nervous system does not have a filter that specific. If you numb the bad, you numb the good right along with it. Real mental strength is not the absence of feeling. It is the presence of feeling combined with the refusal to let that feeling dictate your behavior. This distinction changes everything. A mentally strong person still feels fear before a high-stakes decision. They still feel hurt when someone they trust betrays them. They still feel frustration when a project fails after months of work. The difference between them and someone emotionally weak is not the presence of the emotion. It is what happens in the 60 seconds after the emotion arrives. The emotionally weak person is hijacked. Their next action is dictated entirely by the feeling. The mentally strong person feels it fully, names it, and then chooses their next action based on their values and their goals, not based on the emotional weather passing through them in that moment. Think of your emotions like weather and your values like the compass you use to navigate. Weak navigation means you only ever travel in the direction the wind happens to be blowing that day. Strong navigation means the wind can howl, it can rain, it can be freezing cold, and you are still walking toward your destination because your direction was never determined by the weather in the first place. This is the real definition of mental strength, and once you adopt it, you free yourself from the exhausting and impossible task of trying to feel nothing. There is a second myth tangled up in the first one, and it is the idea that mentally strong people do not need anyone, that asking for help, admitting struggle, or leaning on another person is a form of weakness. This is equally false and equally damaging. Every elite performer, every resilient leader, every person who has walked through genuine hardship and come out stronger on the other side has had support systems, mentors, therapists, or trusted people around them. Isolation is not strength. It is often the fastest path to breaking completely, because humans are not built to process everything alone. Strength is not doing it all by yourself. Strength is doing the hard internal work while still being wise enough to build and use the support that makes that work sustainable. So if you walk away from this chapter with one idea, let it be this: stop trying to become someone who does not feel. Start becoming someone who feels everything and is still able to act with clarity, discipline, and purpose regardless of what they feel. That is not a small shift in language. It is a complete redefinition of the target you have been aiming at. And it is the only version of mental strength that actually holds up under real pressure. Consider the difference this redefinition makes in a real scenario. Two people receive the same harsh piece of feedback from a manager in front of colleagues. The first person, chasing the old, false version of mental strength, forces a blank expression, says nothing, and walks away, telling themselves they did not let it get to them. Inside, the feedback is now looping on repeat, unresolved, and by that evening, it has curdled into either quiet resentment toward the manager or a private conviction that they are incompetent. Nothing was actually processed. It was simply hidden from view, including from themselves. The second person feels the same sting of embarrassment and defensiveness rise in their chest. They notice it. They do not perform composure, they do not feel, but they also do not let the sting dictate an outburst or a spiral. They take the rest of the meeting to let the initial reaction settle. And later, once level-headed, they either address the feedback directly with the manager or extract the useful part of it and quietly let the rest go. Both people looked calm in the room. Only one of them was actually strong. This is also why so many people who appear successful and composed on the outside are privately suffering, and why that gap between appearance and internal reality matters so much. Suppression is efficient at producing a convincing performance. It is terrible at producing genuine well-being. If your goal is simply to look unbothered, you can achieve that with enough practice at masking. But if your goal is to actually be resilient, to make good decisions under pressure, to sustain real relationships, and to enjoy your life rather than merely survive it, masking will eventually collapse under its own weight. The people you admire for their calm under pressure did not get there by feeling less. They got there by building a wider gap between the moment a feeling arrives and the moment they act, and by filling that gap with awareness instead of avoidance. Chapter 3. The Emotional Reprogramming Framework. Now that you understand what mental strength actually is, you need a system to build it, because vague inspiration alone will not rewire years of conditioning. What follows is a 4-stage framework. Think of it as the operating sequence your mind should run through every single time a strong emotion shows up, whether that emotion is anxiety, anger, shame, jealousy, grief, or fear. Master this sequence, and you fundamentally change your relationship with every difficult emotion you will ever face for the rest of your life. Stage 1 is naming. The instant a strong emotion arises, most people skip straight to reacting. Someone criticizes them, and within half a second, they are already defensive, already speaking, already spiraling. The first and most powerful interruption to this automatic chain is simple, silent naming. Not analyzing, not justifying, just naming. This is anger. This is embarrassment. This is fear of being abandoned. Neuroscience has shown repeatedly that the simple act of labeling an emotion reduces activity in the brain's threat response center and increases activity in the region responsible for rational thought. Naming an emotion is not a soft, therapeutic nicety. It is a biological circuit breaker. It takes an overwhelming, formless wave and turns it into a specific, nameable object. And objects can be examined, while waves can only be drowned in. Stage 2 is separation. Once you have named the emotion, you separate yourself from it through language. This sounds small, but it is enormous in practice. Most people say, "I am anxious. I am furious. I am a failure." This phrasing fuses your identity with a temporary state. Instead, practice saying, "I am experiencing anxiety. I am noticing anger. I am having the thought that I am a failure." This linguistic shift creates psychological distance between you, the observer, and the emotion, which is simply a passing experience. You are not your emotions any more than the sky is a passing storm. The sky remains after every storm ends. You remain after every emotion passes. Training yourself to speak this way, even silently in your own head, rewires the automatic fusion between self and feeling that keeps so many people trapped. Stage 3 is the 90-second rule. Physiologically, the initial chemical surge of an emotion, the actual biological wave of a feeling like anger or fear, lasts approximately 90 seconds if you do not feed it with more thought. After that window, if the emotion still feels intense, it is no longer the original biological response. It is a story you are actively generating and re-triggering through your own thinking. When a strong emotion hits, the instruction is simple. Do not act. Do not speak. Do not make a decision. Set an internal timer, even if it is imaginary, for 90 seconds, and simply let the wave move through your body. Breathe slowly. Feel it in your chest, your stomach, your hands, wherever it lives physically. You are not suppressing it. You are allowing it to complete its natural cycle without adding fuel. The difference between someone who ruins a relationship with one sentence, said in anger, and someone who handles conflict with composure is very rarely a difference in the intensity of the emotion they felt. It is almost always this 90-second gap. Stage 4 is directed action. After you have named the emotion, separated your identity from it, and let the initial wave pass, you now choose your next action deliberately, based on your values and your actual goals, not based on the impulse the emotion was generating. Ask yourself one question. Given what I actually want, long-term, in this relationship, in this career, in this life, what is the wisest next action right now? Sometimes the wise action is to have the hard conversation. Sometimes it is to walk away and revisit it tomorrow. Sometimes it is to apologize. Sometimes it is to set a boundary. The emotion itself does not choose the action anymore. You do. Run this sequence enough times, name it, separate from it, Let 90 seconds pass. Choose your action deliberately, and it stops being a conscious effort. It becomes your default operating system. This is not a quick fix. The first dozen times you try this under real pressure, it will feel clumsy and difficult, and you will fail at it more than you succeed. That is not evidence that it does not work. That is simply what skill acquisition looks like. Nobody plays the piano well the first week. You are not failing at mental strength. You are in the early, awkward stage of building it. And every single rep, whether it feels successful or not, is strengthening the exact neural pathway you are trying to build. Let's walk through what this looks like applied to a real, common situation. Because frameworks only become useful once you can see them in motion. Imagine you send a message to someone important to you, and hours pass with no reply. By the third hour, your mind starts constructing an entire narrative. They are angry with you. They are pulling away. You have done something wrong. The old pattern would have you checking your phone every few minutes, drafting anxious follow-up messages, and ruining your afternoon. Instead, you apply the sequence. First, naming. You silently say to yourself, "This is anxiety about uncertainty in a relationship." Second, separation. You reframe the internal language from "I am anxious" to "I am noticing anxiety show up." Third, the 90-second rule. You physically feel the tightness in your chest and stomach. You breathe slowly through it. And instead of feeding it with more catastrophic thinking, you let the initial wave move through without adding a single additional thought to it. Fourth, directed action. Once the wave has passed, you ask what a person who values their own peace and this relationship would actually do right now. And the answer is almost always, live your afternoon normally, and if there is still no response by evening, address it directly and calmly rather than through a flurry of anxious messages. Notice that the external situation, the unanswered message, never changed throughout this entire process. What changed completely was your internal experience of it and your resulting behavior. And that internal shift is the entire game. It is worth being honest about one more thing regarding this framework. There will be emotions so intense, so rooted in real trauma or grief, that 90 seconds will not be enough. And that is not a failure of the method. Grief in particular does not obey a stopwatch, and situations involving real danger, real loss, or real trauma deserve far more space, and often professional support, than a framework designed primarily for everyday emotional reactivity. This sequence is built for the anxiety, anger, embarrassment, jealousy, and frustration that make up the bulk of daily emotional friction, the moments that derail an afternoon or damage a relationship over something that, in a week, will not matter nearly as much as it feels like it does right now. Use it relentlessly for those moments, and extend yourself and others real patience and real support for the deeper ones. Chapter 4. Killing the victim mindset. There is one mental pattern that will sabotage every single tool you have learned so far if you do not confront it directly. And that pattern is the victim mindset. This is one of the hardest chapters in this entire audiobook to listen to honestly, because almost everyone who struggles emotionally has some degree of this pattern running quietly in the background, and almost nobody wants to admit it applies to them. The victim mindset is not about whether bad things have happened to you. Bad things happen to nearly everyone. Some people experience genuine trauma, injustice, and hardship that is not their fault in any way. The victim mindset is not about the events themselves. It is about the story you build around those events and where you place your power in relation to them. Someone with a victim mindset experiences a setback, and their internal narrative becomes, "This proves the world is against me. This proves I am unlucky. This proves nothing will ever work out for me. This is happening to me and I have no control." Someone without a victim mindset can experience the exact same setback and think, "This happened. It hurts. And now what am I going to do about it?" Same event, completely different trajectory for the rest of their life. The reason the victim mindset is so seductive is that it comes with hidden benefits. And this is the part almost nobody wants to hear. When you position yourself as a victim, you are relieved of responsibility. If nothing is your fault, then nothing requires you to change. You get sympathy from others. You get an explanation for every failure that does not require self-examination. You get to stay exactly the same, while still feeling like you have a legitimate reason for your circumstances. These benefits are real, and they are also a trap, because the price of this comfort is your own power. Every time you hand responsibility for your life to external circumstances, other people, bad luck, or the past, you also hand over your ability to change your future. You cannot simultaneously believe you have no control and also expect your life to improve. Those two beliefs cannot coexist. Killing the victim mindset does not mean pretending injustice does not exist, or that you alone are responsible for everything that has ever happened to you. That is an oversimplified, almost cruel version of this idea. And it is not what is being taught here. What it means is separating two different questions that people constantly merge into one. The first question is, whose fault was this? The second question is, whose responsibility is it to respond? These are not the same question. Something can be entirely someone else's fault, a betrayal, an injustice, an unfair circumstance, and it can still be entirely your responsibility to decide how you respond, what you do next, and who you become as a result. Waiting for fault to be acknowledged, apologized for, or corrected before you take responsibility for your own response is handing the remaining years of your life over to someone or something that has already taken enough from you. Practically, killing this pattern starts with catching your own language. Listen to how often the phrases "this always happens to me," "why does this always happen," "I never get a fair chance," or "nothing ever works out for me" appear in your internal dialogue. Each time you catch one, do not judge yourself for it. Simply replace it with a responsibility-based question. Instead of, "Why does this always happen to me?" ask, "What pattern in my choices, environment, or mindset might be contributing to this? And what is one thing within my control I can change starting today?" This single shift, repeated consistently, moves you from a passenger in your own life to the driver. And that shift alone will do more for your emotional strength than almost any other single practice in this audiobook. There is a second, quieter form of the victim mindset that deserves its own attention because it is far easier to miss than the obvious version. It does not sound like complaining. It sounds like realism. It shows up as chronic pessimism dressed up as practicality, the habit of assuming the worst outcome before anything has even happened, so that if it goes badly you can say you knew it would, and if it somehow goes well you can be pleasantly surprised. This feels protective. It feels like emotional armor. In reality, it is a slow, steady tax on your motivation and your nervous system, because you end up living through every negative outcome twice, once in anticipation and once, if it actually happens, while the people around you who choose to expect good outcomes only have to live through disappointment on the rare occasions it actually arrives. Realism does not require pessimism. It requires an honest, clear-eyed assessment of a situation combined with a default assumption that you are capable of handling whatever the outcome turns out to be. That combination, honest assessment plus trust in your own capacity to handle outcomes, is the actual definition of resilience. And it looks nothing like the low-grade dread so many people mistake for being realistic. It also helps to examine who benefits from you staying in a victim posture, because sometimes the answer is uncomfortable. If people around you consistently respond to your victimhood with sympathy, attention, or reduced expectations, some part of your environment has quietly been rewarding the very pattern you are trying to break. This does not mean the people in your life are malicious. Most of the time, they have no idea this dynamic exists. But if you begin to reclaim your responsibility and your power, do not be surprised if it initially feels lonelier, or if certain relationships shift, because the role you are stepping out of served a function in that relationship's dynamic. This is not a reason to stay small. It is simply a warning, so that the discomfort of that shift does not convince you that you are doing something wrong. You are not. You are outgrowing a role that was never actually serving you, no matter how much temporary comfort it provided. Chapter 5. Building unshakable emotional discipline. Understanding all of this intellectually will change nothing if you do not build daily practices that turn these ideas into trained reflexes. Emotional discipline, like physical discipline, is built through repeated, deliberate exposure and practice, not through reading or listening alone. This chapter gives you the daily architecture required to actually become the person described in the earlier chapters. The first practice is voluntary discomfort, because emotional weakness is partly built by a life engineered to avoid friction. Rebuilding strength requires deliberately reintroducing small, controlled amounts of discomfort on a regular basis. This can be as simple as taking a cold shower each morning, delaying a meal you are craving by an hour, sitting in silence for 10 minutes without any device nearby, or having a difficult conversation you have been avoiding instead of postponing it again. None of these individually will transform your life. What they do is train your nervous system to recognize discomfort as something survivable and temporary, rather than something to be feared and immediately escaped. Every time you voluntarily choose discomfort and get through it, you are casting a vote for the identity of someone who can handle hard things, and that identity compounds over time. The second practice is the daily emotional audit. At the end of each day, spend 3 to 5 minutes reviewing what emotions showed up, what triggered them, and how you responded. Did you run the naming and separation sequence? Or did you get hijacked? Where were you reactive instead of deliberate? This is not about self-criticism. It is about data collection. You cannot improve a pattern you are not tracking, Most people go through years of emotional turbulence without ever once sitting down and objectively studying their own patterns, which means they keep repeating the same reactive cycles without realizing it. 5 minutes a day of honest reflection will teach you more about your own emotional architecture than years of unexamined living. The third practice is controlled exposure to criticism and rejection. One of the fastest ways to build genuine emotional resilience is to deliberately seek out small doses of the exact thing you currently fear most. If criticism destroys you, ask a trusted person for honest, specific feedback on something you have created, on purpose, on a regular basis. If rejection terrifies you, put yourself in low-stakes situations where rejection is a real possibility, a request that might be denied, an idea that might be dismissed. This is not about becoming reckless or seeking pain for its own sake. It is about proving to your nervous system, through direct evidence, that criticism and rejection, while uncomfortable, are survivable and do not actually destroy you. Right now, your fear of these things is based on imagination and avoidance. Every time you face a small, real dose of it and survive, that fear loses a measurable amount of its power. The fourth practice is values-based journaling. Once a week, write down, in a few sentences, who you want to be. Not what you want to have or achieve, but who you want to be in terms of character. Calm under pressure. Honest even when it costs you something. Someone who shows up for people. Someone who does not abandon their goals the moment things get hard. Then briefly review your week against that description. Where did you live up to it? And where did you fall short? This practice keeps your compass, the one mentioned back in Chapter 2, sharp and clearly defined, so that when strong emotions arrive, you have an actual reference point to navigate toward, instead of simply reacting to whatever feeling is loudest in the moment. None of these four practices are complicated. None of them require special equipment, expensive courses, or years of therapy to begin. Although therapy is a valuable and legitimate tool if you have access to it and it would help you. What they require is consistency. The willingness to do something small and slightly uncomfortable every single day, rather than something dramatic and unsustainable once. Emotional discipline is not built in a single breakthrough moment. It is built in the accumulation of 1,000 small choices to respond rather than react, to face discomfort rather than avoid it, and to hold your own compass steady while the emotional weather rages around you. A final point on these practices matters more than it might first appear, and it is about sequencing expectations correctly. Almost everyone who begins this kind of work expects linear progress, a smooth upward line where each week feels noticeably calmer than the last. That is not how it actually goes, and expecting it to go that way is one of the most common reasons people quit. Real emotional growth looks more like a jagged upward trend. Weeks of genuine progress followed by a day where an old pattern comes roaring back with full force, seemingly out of nowhere, often triggered by exhaustion, stress stacking from an unrelated area of life, or a situation that specifically resembles an old wound. When this happens, and it will happen, the instinct is to interpret it as proof that none of the work has mattered, that you are back at square one, that you are still the same emotionally weak person you were before you started. This interpretation is simply inaccurate. A single difficult day, or even a difficult week, does not erase months of rewired neural pathways. and rebuilt habits. It is a temporary regression inside a larger upward trajectory, not evidence that the trajectory does not exist. The people who actually complete this transformation are not the people who never regress. They are the people who regress. Notice it without excessive self-judgment, and simply pick the practices back up the next day, treating the setback as data rather than as a verdict on their character. Keep one more thing in view as you move forward from here. Everything covered in these 5 chapters. Understanding where weakness was built, redefining what strength actually means, learning the reprogramming sequence, dismantling the victim mindset, and installing daily disciplined practice forms the foundation. It is not the entire structure. What comes next builds directly on top of this foundation, moving into how to handle triggers and criticism without collapsing, how to construct an identity that does not break under pressure, and how to make the final, permanent choice that separates the people who read about change from the people who actually become it. The foundation you have just built is already enough to notice a real difference if you apply it starting today. Do not wait until you have absorbed everything before you begin practicing. Start now, with the very next emotion that shows up in your day, and let the rest of this build on top of action already in motion, rather than knowledge sitting still. Chapter 6. Handling triggers without losing control. Everyone has them. Certain words, certain tones of voice, certain situations that seem to bypass every ounce of composure you have built and drop you instantly back into a reactive, overwhelmed state, as if years of progress evaporated in a single sentence. These are triggers. And understanding how they actually work is the difference between being ambushed by them for the rest of your life and eventually disarming them almost completely. A trigger is not really about the present moment, even though it always feels like it is. When someone raises their voice at you and your entire body floods with fear or defensiveness, far beyond what the situation logically calls for, you are not simply reacting to that person in that room. You are reacting to every similar moment your nervous system has filed away as dangerous across your entire life, often stretching back to childhood. The current moment is the trigger, but the intensity of the reaction is coming from the accumulated weight of everything it resembles. This is why 2 people can experience the exact same criticism from a coworker, and one shrugs it off within minutes while the other spirals for the rest of the week. They are not experiencing the same event internally, even though the external event was identical. One person's nervous system has that particular type of interaction filed under manageable and safe. The other person's nervous system has it filed under danger, based on old experiences that have nothing to do with the coworker standing in front of them right now. The first step to handling triggers is identifying your personal pattern. Because triggers are rarely random, they cluster around specific themes. Common clusters include feeling disrespected or talked down to, feeling abandoned or ignored, feeling controlled or having your autonomy threatened, feeling excluded, and feeling incompetent or exposed as inadequate. Take an honest inventory of the last several times you completely lost your composure, whether that meant lashing out, shutting down, or spiraling internally. Look for the common thread. Most people discover that 80% of their most intense reactions trace back to 1 or 2 specific themes, not a random assortment of unrelated triggers. Once you can name your specific theme, for example, I get triggered most intensely when I feel disrespected in front of other people, you gain an enormous advantage because you can now recognize the pattern the moment it starts activating rather than being blindsided by it every single time. The second step is building what can be called a pause ritual, a small, specific, physical action you take. The instant you notice a trigger firing, before you say or do anything else. This might be placing both feet firmly on the ground and noticing the physical sensation of contact with the floor. It might be taking one slow breath in through the nose for a count of 4 and out through the mouth for a count of 6, which physiologically activates the parasympathetic nervous system and begins calming the body even before your mind has caught up. It might be silently naming the trigger theme you identified, saying internally, "This is the disrespect trigger firing right now." The specific ritual matters less than the consistency of using it every single time, because repetition is what turns it from a conscious effort into an automatic circuit breaker that fires before the old reactive pattern gets a chance to take over completely. Building this pause ritual works best when you rehearse it during calm moments, rather than trying to invent it for the first time in the middle of an actual trigger. Athletes do not learn their reflexes during the championship game. They drill them thousands of times in ordinary practice sessions until the reflex requires no conscious thought at all. In the moment it actually matters. Take 5 minutes today, while nothing is currently triggering you, and actually practice the physical sensation of your chosen pause ritual. Feel your feet on the ground right now. Take the 4-count inhale and 6-count exhale right now, several times, so your body has a template stored and ready before it is ever needed under real pressure. This might feel unnecessary or even a little silly to do in a calm state. But this is precisely the kind of preparation that determines whether a tool is actually available to you in the heat of a real trigger, or whether it remains a nice idea you understood intellectually but never had access to when it counted. The third step is understanding that a trigger firing does not mean you have failed. This point cannot be overstated because so many people, once they start doing this kind of internal work, become harshly critical of themselves every time an old trigger still manages to hijack them. The goal was never to reach a state where triggers no longer exist. Some of them, especially the ones rooted in genuine early wounds, may soften considerably over years of work, but never disappear completely. And that is a normal, human outcome, not a sign of failure. The actual goal, and the realistic one, is to shrink the gap between the trigger firing and your recovery. Where it once took you 3 days to recover from feeling disrespected, it now takes 3 hours. Where it once took 3 hours, it now takes 30 minutes. This is what real progress looks like. Not the complete elimination of sensitivity, but a dramatic and continuous shrinking of how long that sensitivity is allowed to run your behavior. Finally, understand that criticism deserves its own specific attention within this chapter, because it is one of the most universal triggers there is. Almost nobody enjoys being criticized. But the emotionally weak response and the mentally strong response diverge sharply after the initial sting. The weak response treats all criticism as equally threatening, whether it comes from someone whose opinion genuinely matters and is offered constructively, or from an anonymous stranger with no stake in your life and no expertise in the subject. The strong response applies a filter before reacting. Ask 2 questions whenever criticism lands. Does this person have relevant knowledge or a genuine relationship with me that gives their opinion real weight? And is there a specific, actionable piece of truth inside what they said? even if the delivery was harsh. If the answer to both is no, the criticism can be acknowledged and released without further processing, because giving it more weight than it deserves is simply self-inflicted suffering. If the answer to either is yes, extract the useful piece. Thank yourself for having the strength to hear it, and let the rest, including the tone it was delivered in, fall away. This single filter alone will save you an enormous amount of unnecessary emotional damage over the course of your life. There is one more layer to triggers worth addressing directly, and it concerns the people in your life who seem to know exactly which buttons to press, whether intentionally or not. Some relationships, particularly long-standing ones with family members or old friends, carry years of accumulated history, which means a single sentence from that specific person can carry the weight of 100 similar sentences from your past, even if their intent in that particular moment was mild. This is why an offhand comment from a close relative can devastate you in a way an identical comment from a stranger never could. Recognizing this dynamic in advance is itself a form of preparation. Before entering situations with people who have historically been significant triggers for you, take a moment to consciously remind yourself of this dynamic, so that when the familiar sting arrives, you can recognize it immediately as the old pattern activating rather than being caught completely off guard by its intensity. Preparation does not eliminate the trigger, but it dramatically shortens the time it takes you to recognize what is happening and apply the tools you already have. Chapter 7. The Art of Emotional Boundaries. Nearly every person who struggles with emotional weakness also struggles with boundaries. And this is not a coincidence. It is a direct cause and effect relationship that almost nobody explains clearly. If you do not know where you end and other people's moods, opinions, and demands begin, you will spend your entire life emotionally at the mercy of everyone around you. Building real mental strength requires building real boundaries. And this chapter is going to show you exactly what that means in practice. Because the word boundaries has become so overused in popular culture that its actual meaning has become blurry. A boundary is not a wall, and it is not punishment. A boundary is simply a clear, honest statement of what you will and will not accept, participate in, or tolerate. Communicated in advance whenever possible, and enforced consistently through your own actions rather than through controlling someone else's behavior. This distinction matters enormously. You cannot force another person to stop raising their voice at you, to stop being unreliable, or to stop disrespecting your time. What you can control is your own response to those behaviors. And a real boundary sounds less like a demand placed on someone else, and more like a decision about yourself. Not, "You need to stop yelling at me," which relies entirely on someone else's cooperation, but rather, if the conversation becomes raised voices, "I will end it and revisit the topic later when things are calmer," which is entirely within your own power to enforce regardless of what the other person decides to do. The reason boundaries are so central to emotional strength is that without them, you have no protection against having your emotional state hijacked constantly by other people's moods, crises, and demands. If you have no boundary around your time, you will find yourself constantly overcommitted, resentful, and exhausted. And that chronic depletion makes you far more vulnerable to emotional collapse under even minor additional pressure. If you have no boundary around how others are allowed to speak to you, you will absorb disrespect as a normal part of daily life, and that absorption slowly erodes your baseline sense of self-worth until small slights start to feel like devastating blows because your reserve has already been drained by years of unaddressed disrespect. Boundaries are not about becoming cold or distant. They are about protecting the internal resources you need in order to remain calm, generous, and present with the people who actually deserve that version of you. Most people who struggle with setting boundaries are not struggling because they lack the words. They know exactly what they would say if they could say it. They are struggling because somewhere underneath the surface, they believe that setting a boundary will cause them to lose the relationship, the approval, or the peace they currently, precariously, have. This fear deserves to be named directly, because until it is confronted, no amount of scripted boundary language will actually get used in real moments. The uncomfortable truth is that some relationships genuinely cannot survive you having boundaries, because those relationships were only functioning because you had none. This is painful to accept, but it is also clarifying, because it means that every relationship that does survive your boundaries, and most healthy ones, will not only survive them but improve because of them, was built on a foundation solid enough to hold real respect in both directions. Losing a relationship that could only exist without your boundaries is not really a loss of something valuable. It is the removal of a structure that was quietly costing you your own well-being in exchange for its continued existence. It is also worth preparing yourself in advance for the specific discomfort that tends to show up during the first several weeks of establishing new boundaries, because this discomfort is predictable, and it catches almost everyone off guard the first time they experience it. When you have spent years being the person who always says yes, who never pushes back, who absorbs whatever is placed on them without objection, the people around you have built their expectations of you around that pattern, and any deviation from it will initially be met with surprise, sometimes mild pushback, and occasionally genuine testing, whether conscious or not, to see if the new boundary is real or temporary. This is not evidence that you are doing something wrong. It is simply the natural friction of a system recalibrating to a new equilibrium. Hold steady through this initial period. Remain calm and consistent, rather than defensive or apologetic about the boundary itself. And in the overwhelming majority of cases, the people worth keeping in your life will adjust, often within a few weeks, to a version of the relationship that is more honest and considerably more sustainable than the one built on your previous, boundaryless pattern. Practically, start small. You do not need to overhaul every relationship in your life simultaneously, which is both overwhelming and unnecessary. Choose one specific, low-stakes boundary this week. It might be not answering work messages after a certain hour. It might be telling a friend directly that you need to reschedule instead of showing up resentful and distracted. It might be simply saying, "Let me think about that and get back to you," instead of agreeing to something immediately out of a reflexive need to avoid disappointing someone. Practice the discomfort of holding that one small boundary. Notice that the world does not end. Notice that most people adjust and respect it far more easily than your anxiety predicted, and then build outward from there. Boundaries, like every other skill in this audiobook, are built through repetition under real conditions, not through understanding the concept perfectly in theory. One final distinction is essential here, because without it, boundary setting can quietly curdle into something unhealthy in the opposite direction. A boundary is not the same thing as punishment, withdrawal used as manipulation, or silent treatment disguised as self-care. If you find yourself using a boundary specifically to hurt or control another person's behavior, to make them feel guilty enough to change, that is no longer a boundary. It has become a different kind of emotional weapon, and it will keep you just as entangled in trying to control someone else's reaction as the lack of boundaries did in the first place. A genuine boundary is calm, clear, and focused entirely on your own actions rather than on engineering a specific reaction in someone else. It sounds less like, "I am doing this to teach you a lesson," and more like, "This is what I need in order to remain healthy in this relationship," stated plainly and then followed through on consistently, regardless of whether the other person reacts with immediate understanding, resistance, or something in between. The goal was never to control how they respond. The goal was only ever to remain in control of yourself. Chapter 8. Turning setbacks into fuel. Every single person who has ever built anything meaningful, a career, a body of work, a strong family, a resilient sense of self, has been knocked down repeatedly along the way. The difference between the people who eventually succeed and the people who quietly give up is almost never the number of setbacks they experienced. It is what they did with the setback in the hours and days immediately following it. And this chapter is about installing a specific, deliberate process for turning failure from a source of collapse into a source of fuel. The first thing that must be dismantled is the belief that setbacks are evidence of your fundamental limitations. When something fails, whether it is a relationship, a business attempt, a creative project, or a personal goal, the emotionally weak interpretation collapses the event into an identity statement. "I failed" becomes, "I am a failure." This is not a small linguistic difference. It is the entire hinge point of whether a setback becomes temporary or permanent in your mind. A specific event is, by definition, something that happened at a particular time, under particular circumstances, and specific events can be analyzed, learned from, and changed the next time around. An identity is, by contrast, treated as fixed and unchangeable, which means there is nothing to do with it except feel ashamed of it. The moment you catch yourself converting an event into an identity statement, deliberately convert it back. Not, "I am bad at this," but rather, "That specific attempt did not work, and here is what I am going to do differently on the next attempt." The second piece is understanding the actual function of failure in any skill or endeavor worth pursuing. Failure is not a sign that you are on the wrong path. In almost every domain, from athletic performance to entrepreneurship to relationships, failure is simply the primary mechanism through which the necessary information gets delivered. You cannot know which approach will not work until you have tried it and watched it not work. This means that every failure, painful as it feels in the moment, is not happening instead of your progress. It is a required component of your progress. People who achieve extraordinary things in any field are not people who failed less than everyone else. In most cases, they failed considerably more because they were willing to keep attempting things at a volume that guaranteed a higher total number of failures, along with a higher total number of eventual successes. Reframe failure from being the opposite of success to being one of the raw materials success is built from, and setbacks stop feeling like proof you should stop and start feeling like evidence you are actually doing the work required to eventually get somewhere. This reframe also changes how you relate to the fear of failure before you have even attempted something, which is often more paralyzing than the failure itself ever turns out to be. Most people spend far more energy dreading a potential setback than they would actually spend recovering from the real thing if it happened. The anticipation inflates the danger far beyond its actual size. because imagination has no natural limit, while real experience always does. Once you have been through the after-action review process a handful of times and watched yourself recover fully from setbacks you once assumed would be unbearable, the anticipatory fear itself begins to shrink, not because you have become reckless or stopped caring about outcomes, but because you now have direct, lived evidence that you are considerably more capable of absorbing difficulty than your imagination gives you credit for in advance. The third piece, and the most practical one, is the after-action review, a habit borrowed from high-performance military and athletic training that translates directly into everyday life. Within a day or two of a significant setback, once the initial emotional wave has passed, using the tools from earlier chapters, sit down and answer 3 specific questions in writing. What actually happened, described as factually and without dramatization as possible. What within my control contributed to this outcome? Focusing only on what you can influence, rather than external factors you cannot change. And what is the single most important adjustment I will make before my next attempt? This structured review accomplishes something crucial that unstructured rumination never achieves. Rumination replays the setback over and over without producing any forward movement, simply deepening the emotional groove of shame or anxiety associated with it. The after-action review extracts the useful lesson, closes the loop, and gives your mind explicit permission to stop replaying the event because it has already been processed and converted into a concrete plan. Understand that resilience is not about bouncing back to exactly where you were before the setback. It is about integrating the setback into a version of yourself that is more capable than the version that existed before it happened. Every setback you process correctly using the tools in this audiobook leaves you with information, calibration, and evidence of your own capacity to survive difficulty that the previous version of you did not have. This is why people who have weathered real hardship and processed it well often possess a kind of grounded calm that people who have been sheltered from difficulty simply do not have access to yet. It is not that hardship is something to seek out for its own sake. It is that hardship, faced directly rather than avoided or suppressed, is one of the most reliable teachers of genuine strength that exists. And every setback you are currently dreading is also, whether it feels like it right now or not, an opportunity to become someone your past self would not recognize. There is a particular kind of setback worth addressing separately because it does not resolve as cleanly as a failed project or a missed opportunity, and that is the setback involving other people, a friendship that ends badly, a betrayal, a relationship that fails despite genuine effort. These setbacks are harder to extract clean lessons from because they involve another person's choices, which were never entirely within your control to begin with. The after-action review still applies, but the third question shifts slightly in these cases. Instead of asking only what you would do differently, also ask what this experience taught you about the kind of people, environments, or dynamics you want to move toward or away from going forward. Sometimes the most valuable lesson from a relational setback is not a change in your own behavior at all, but a sharpened sense of discernment about who and what deserves your continued investment. Extracting that kind of clarity, rather than simply carrying forward the raw pain of the experience, is what allows you to remain open to future relationships instead of gradually building walls that protect you from pain while also quietly cutting you off from connection. Chapter 9. Silencing the inner critic. There is a voice inside your head that comments on nearly everything you do. And for most people struggling with emotional weakness, that voice is relentlessly harsh. It tells you that you are not good enough the moment you make a mistake. It predicts failure before you have even started. It compares you constantly to other people and finds you lacking. This voice, commonly called the inner critic, is one of the most powerful and least examined forces shaping how emotionally resilient you are able to become. And this chapter is dedicated entirely to understanding where it comes from and how to finally take away its authority over you. The inner critic did not appear out of nowhere. In almost every case, it is an internalized collection of voices from your past, parents, teachers, early peers, or cultural messaging that has been running on autopilot for so long that it now feels like your own authentic thought rather than something that was absorbed from outside. This matters enormously because most people treat the inner critic's statements as objective truth simply because the voice is familiar and constant. If a thought has been repeating in your head since childhood, it feels true in the same way a familiar song feels correct, even if you have never checked the actual lyrics. But familiarity is not the same as accuracy. The inner critic is not a neutral, objective assessor of your worth and competence. It is an old recording, and old recordings can be examined, questioned, and eventually replaced. One of the most effective tools for reducing the inner critic's power is a deceptively simple exercise called the third-person test. The next time you notice a harsh internal statement, something like, "You are so stupid for messing that up," or "Nobody actually likes you," pause and ask a direct question. Would I ever say this exact sentence, in this exact tone, to a close friend who came to me with the same struggle? For almost everyone, the honest answer is an immediate and obvious no. You would never tell a friend who made a mistake that they are stupid and worthless. You would offer perspective, remind them of their strengths, and help them see the situation clearly. The inner critic operates under a set of rules you would never accept from another human being, and yet you allow it to speak to you that way constantly, often multiple times a day, without ever questioning why it gets an exemption that no other voice in your life would be granted. This leads directly to the core practice of this chapter, which is deliberately speaking to yourself the way you would speak to someone you genuinely cared about. This is often dismissed as soft or as empty positive thinking, but it is neither. It is not about telling yourself flattering lies or pretending mistakes did not happen. It is about applying the same combination of honesty and compassion to yourself that you would naturally extend to a friend. A good friend does not lie to you about your mistakes, but they also do not use those mistakes as an excuse to attack your worth as a person. When you catch the inner critic escalating a specific mistake into a global statement about your value, consciously interrupt it and replace the statement with something both honest and kind. Not, "I am terrible at this and I will never improve," but rather, "That attempt did not go well, and here is what I am going to adjust," which happens to be exactly the same after action review framework introduced in the previous chapter, now applied specifically to how you talk to yourself. It is worth being honest that this shift feels unnatural and even fake at first, particularly if the inner critic has been running unchallenged for decades. This discomfort is not evidence that the practice is wrong. It is simply evidence that you are interrupting a deeply worn neural pathway. And any interruption of a deeply worn pathway feels awkward before it feels natural. Exactly the same way, switching from your dominant hand to your non-dominant hand feels clumsy at first, despite both hands being equally capable of eventually performing the task well. Every time you catch the inner critic mid-sentence and consciously choose a more honest, less cruel version of the same thought, you are not being naive or soft. You are doing the exact same rewiring work described throughout this entire audiobook, applied to the most persistent and influential voice you will ever have to manage, the one that never stops talking and that you will be listening to for the rest of your life. It also helps to recognize the specific purpose the inner critic originally believed it was serving, because this voice rarely appears without a reason, even a misguided one. In many cases, the inner critic developed as a preemptive defense mechanism, operating on the flawed logic that if it criticizes you first, and, harshly enough, external criticism and failure will hurt less because you were already braced for it, or that harsh self-criticism is what actually keeps you motivated and prevents complacency. Both of these beliefs feel intuitively true to the part of you that built them, and both are demonstrably false when examined honestly. Preemptive self-criticism does not soften the blow of external failure. It simply means you are absorbing 2 rounds of pain instead of 1. And harsh self-criticism does not reliably produce better performance. Extensive research on motivation consistently shows that self-compassion paired with clear accountability produces more sustained effort and better outcomes than self-attack, because shame tends to produce avoidance and withdrawal rather than renewed effort. Once you can see clearly that the inner critic's underlying strategy does not even accomplish what it believes it is accomplishing, it becomes considerably easier to stop granting it the authority it has been operating with for so long. Chapter 10. The Identity Shift. Everything covered up to this point. Understanding where weakness came from. Redefining strength. The reprogramming sequence. Killing the victim mindset. Daily discipline. Handling triggers. Building boundaries. Converting setbacks into fuel, and silencing the inner critic ultimately funnels into a single, decisive shift that determines whether any of it becomes permanent or simply fades after a few motivated weeks. That shift is identity. You can practice every technique in this audiobook diligently for months and still relapse into old patterns if, underneath all of that effort, you still privately believe you are fundamentally a fragile, easily overwhelmed person who is simply managing to fake competence through willpower. Real, lasting change requires the belief itself to change, not just the behavior sitting on top of it. Human behavior overwhelmingly follows identity, not the other way around, despite most people assuming the reverse. You do not simply do calm, disciplined actions and eventually become a calm, disciplined person as a side effect. In practice, the causation runs the other direction far more powerfully. The moment you genuinely start to see yourself as someone who handles pressure well, your brain begins unconsciously seeking out evidence to confirm that identity and begins filtering your behavior to remain consistent with it. The exact same mechanism that, back in Chapter 1, was described trapping people into weakness when their identity was fragile person, now working powerfully in your favor once the identity underneath it has changed. This is not mystical thinking. It is simply how self-concept and behavior reinforce each other in both directions, and it means that identity work is not a soft, optional add-on to practical technique. It is the mechanism that determines whether the technique sticks. The most direct way to begin shifting identity is through what can be called evidence collection. Your current identity whatever it currently is, was not built through abstract belief. It was built through years of accumulated evidence, moments where you acted in ways consistent with being fragile or overwhelmed, which your mind then filed away as proof of who you are. A new identity gets built the exact same way, through accumulated evidence. Except now you are going to start deliberately generating and noticing that evidence instead of leaving it to chance. Every single time you use the naming and separation sequence instead of being hijacked by an emotion, that is evidence. Every time you hold a boundary you would have previously abandoned, that is evidence. Every time you face criticism, extract the useful piece and let the rest go instead of spiraling. That is evidence. Keep a literal, physical, or digital record of these moments, if it helps, however small they seem. The goal is not to convince yourself you have transformed overnight through positive thinking. It is to build an honest, growing case file of proof that the old identity is no longer an accurate description of who you actually are, based on your own repeated actions, rather than your own repeated assumptions. The second component of this shift is choosing, consciously and specifically, the language you use to describe yourself, both internally and out loud to others. Language is not merely descriptive, it is instructive. It tells your nervous system what role to keep performing. If you continue introducing yourself, even jokingly, as someone who is not good under pressure, or an overthinker, or emotionally fragile, you are actively rehearsing and reinforcing that identity every single time you say it, regardless of how much internal work you are simultaneously doing to change it. This does not mean pretending to be someone you are not yet, which creates its own kind of dishonesty and internal friction. It means shifting the language toward accurate, present-tense process statements rather than fixed trait statements. Not, "I am completely fearless now," which is neither true nor necessary, but rather, "I am someone who is actively working on staying grounded under pressure, and I am getting better at it every week." This kind of language is honest. It acknowledges the ongoing nature of the work, and it still firmly plants your identity in the category of someone in the process of building strength, rather than someone permanently defined by its absence. Understand that this identity shift will not feel dramatic or sudden when it actually happens. There will not be a single defining moment where you wake up and know with total certainty that you have become a fundamentally different person. Instead, it happens the way most real transformation happens: quietly, gradually, and often only visible in retrospect. 6 months from now, if you have genuinely applied what has been covered so far, you will find yourself in a situation that would have completely derailed you today. And you will notice, almost as an afterthought, that you handled it without the old collapse, without the spiral, without the 3 days of recovery it would have previously required. That moment, small and undramatic as it will feel, is the identity shift made visible. It was not built in that moment. It was built in every single rep leading up to it, most of which felt like nothing more than ordinary, unremarkable effort at the time. There is one caution worth ending this chapter on. Because identity work, powerful as it is, can be misapplied if it is rushed. Do not attempt to force the new identity into existence by pretending the old patterns are already gone before they actually are. This creates a fragile, performative version of strength that cracks the moment real pressure arrives, precisely because it was built on denial rather than on genuine, accumulated evidence. The identity shift described in this chapter is not something you declare into existence through a single decision or a single powerful sentence repeated in a mirror each morning. However popular that idea has become, it is something you earn, rep by rep, through the accumulation of moments where you actually did the harder, more disciplined thing instead of the old automatic reaction. Trust the process outlined across these 10 chapters. Trust that the accumulation is happening even on days when it does not feel like it. And trust that the version of you capable of remaining grounded under real pressure is not a distant fantasy. It is simply a version of you that has not yet accumulated enough evidence to fully believe in itself, and every chapter still ahead is going to keep building that evidence higher. Chapter 11. Building Unbreakable Confidence. Confidence is one of the most misunderstood qualities in the entire self-improvement conversation, because most people believe it is a feeling that arrives before action, a kind of internal permission slip that must be granted before you are allowed to move forward. This belief keeps people frozen for years, waiting for a sensation of readiness that, for almost everyone, never actually arrives on its own. Real, durable confidence does not work this way, and understanding the actual mechanism behind it will change how you approach every difficult thing you attempt for the rest of your life. Confidence is not a prerequisite for action. It is a byproduct of action, specifically the accumulated result of having done difficult things before and survived them. Think about anything you currently feel genuinely confident doing, whether that is driving a car, having a basic conversation with a stranger, or cooking a familiar meal. You were not born confident at any of these things. You became confident at them only after repeating them enough times that your nervous system built a reliable track record of competence and survival. Confidence, in other words, is retrospective. It is built by looking backward at evidence, not by manufacturing a feeling in advance of evidence existing. This means the common advice to simply believe in yourself before attempting something new is, at best, incomplete, and, at worst, actively unhelpful, because it asks you to produce a feeling that biologically has no raw material to be built from yet. This is precisely why so many people who consume enormous amounts of motivational content still feel just as insecure as they did before they started, despite months or years of exposure to messages telling them to simply believe in themselves. Belief was never the missing ingredient. Evidence was. And evidence can only be generated through actual attempts made in the real world, not through repeated exposure to encouraging words. If you have spent years absorbing motivational material without a corresponding increase in genuine, lived confidence, this is almost certainly why, and it is worth releasing any residual belief that your struggle with confidence reflects some personal deficiency in how motivated or receptive you are. It reflects, instead, a simple and correctable mismatch between the kind of input you have been consuming and the kind of input confidence actually requires to be built. The actual mechanism for building confidence is the same evidence collection process described earlier in this audiobook, applied specifically to competence rather than emotional resilience. Confidence in any specific domain is built through what can be called the exposure ladder. A deliberately structured sequence of attempts that starts below your current comfort threshold and gradually increases in difficulty as evidence of your own capability accumulates. If public speaking terrifies you, the exposure ladder does not begin with a keynote in front of 1,000 people. It begins with speaking up once in a small meeting, then contributing an idea in a slightly larger group, then perhaps presenting for 2 minutes to a handful of trusted colleagues, each rung slightly more demanding than the last, and each successful rung adding another data point to the growing case that you are, in fact, capable of doing this. Confidence built this way is durable precisely because it is earned rather than performed. And durable confidence does not collapse the first time you encounter difficulty, because difficulty was already priced into how it was built in the first place. Building your own exposure ladder for a specific area of insecurity is a worthwhile exercise to actually complete rather than simply understand conceptually. Take one area where your confidence currently feels shaky, whether that is a professional skill, a social situation, or a physical challenge, and write out 5 to 7 specific rungs ordered from least to most intimidating. Each one a concrete, attemptable action rather than a vague aspiration. The specificity matters enormously here. A vague goal like get better at networking provides no clear entry point and tends to stay permanently unattempted, while a specific first rung like introduce myself to one new person at the next event I attend gives you something you can actually do this week, generating real evidence almost immediately, rather than remaining an abstract intention indefinitely. Once the ladder exists in concrete, written form, the path from insecurity to genuine competence stops being a mysterious, intimidating unknown and becomes simply a series of specific next steps, each one only slightly harder than something you have already proven you can survive. It is important to distinguish real confidence from its counterfeit, which is far more common and considerably more fragile. Counterfeit confidence is built entirely on the outside, through validation, attention, comparison to others, or the temporary high of external praise. It looks convincing from a distance, sometimes even louder and more visible than the real thing, but it is entirely dependent on external conditions remaining favorable, and it shatters the instant those conditions change. A failed attempt, a public mistake, someone else's success highlighting your own perceived shortcomings. Real confidence, built through the exposure ladder and grounded in your own track record rather than in other people's opinions, does not require constant external reinforcement to remain intact, because its foundation was never external in the first place. When you notice yourself needing constant praise, comparison, or validation to feel good about your abilities, that is a signal that the confidence in that particular area is still counterfeit, and the antidote is not more praise, it is more direct, personally earned evidence through actual attempts. A useful diagnostic question for telling the two apart in your own life is this: does your sense of confidence in this area remain roughly stable, whether or not anyone else is watching or commenting on it? Real confidence persists in private. In the moments when no one is available to praise or validate the effort, because it was built from your own internal track record rather than from an external audience's reaction. Counterfeit confidence tends to fluctuate wildly depending on the presence and reaction of an audience, feeling strong when praised and collapsing almost entirely the moment that praise is absent, or, worse, replaced with criticism. If you notice a specific area of your life where your confidence seems to swing dramatically based on external feedback rather than remaining relatively steady. That is precisely the area most in need of deliberate exposure ladder work. Building a genuine, personally earned track record that does not require an audience to remain solid. A final and often overlooked component of unbreakable confidence is what can be called competence separate from outcome. Many people conflate confidence with certainty of success, believing that a confident person always expects to win. This is inaccurate and sets an impossible standard, because no amount of preparation guarantees a specific outcome in a world full of variables outside your control. Genuine confidence is not the belief that you will always succeed. It is the belief that regardless of the outcome, you are capable of handling whatever happens, that you will learn from failure, adapt, and continue moving forward, rather than being destroyed by a result that did not go your way. This is a subtle but critical distinction, because confidence tied to guaranteed outcomes is fragile and will eventually be shattered by an outcome you cannot control, while confidence tied to your own capacity to handle any outcome is nearly indestructible, because it does not depend on the universe cooperating with your plans, only on your own demonstrated ability to keep functioning and growing regardless of what the universe decides to hand you. There is also a specific trap worth naming here, because it catches people who have already made real progress through the earlier chapters of this audiobook. It is the trap of waiting for the exposure ladder to become comfortable before continuing to climb it. Discomfort does not fully disappear at any rung of the ladder, including the highest ones. Even people with decades of experience and immense track records of success still feel a version of the same nervous energy before a high-stakes moment that a complete beginner feels before their very first attempt. The difference is not the presence or absence of the sensation. It is the meaning attached to it. The experienced person has learned to interpret that same physiological arousal as readiness and focus rather than as danger, using precisely the naming and reframing tools from earlier chapters, while a beginner interprets identical sensations as proof they are not ready. Confidence, at its highest level, is not the disappearance of nervous energy before something important. It is the skill of continuing to act competently in its presence every single time, regardless of how many times you have already done it before. Chapter 12. Ancient Wisdom for Modern Pressure. Long before modern psychology had language for concepts like cognitive reframing or emotional regulation, ancient philosophers were already grappling with the exact same problem this entire audiobook is built around: how to remain steady, clear, and functional in a world that constantly throws difficulty, uncertainty, and loss in your direction. The philosophical tradition known as Stoicism, developed in ancient Greece and Rome, produced some of the most practical, battle-tested tools for mental resilience that have ever been written down, and this chapter distills the core principles that remain directly applicable to your daily life today, thousands of years later. The foundational Stoic principle, and arguably the single most useful idea in this entire audiobook when applied consistently, is the division between what is within your control and what is not. Nearly all unnecessary suffering comes from investing emotional energy into outcomes you cannot actually control: other people's opinions of you, the past, the unpredictable behavior of others, events that have not happened yet and may never happen. The Stoics taught a radical and liberating reorientation, directing your full effort and attention toward the narrow category of things that are actually within your control, namely your own judgments, your own effort, and your own responses, while meeting everything outside that category with a kind of calm acceptance, not passive resignation, but the recognition that fighting against what cannot be changed is simply wasted energy that could otherwise be directed toward what can. Practically, whenever you notice yourself in distress, ask a direct question. Is the thing I am upset about actually within my control right now? If it is, direct your energy toward action. If it is not, direct your energy toward acceptance, because there is genuinely nothing else productive to do with it. It helps to actually practice sorting a real, current worry through this filter, rather than only understanding it as an abstract concept. Take whatever is currently weighing on you most heavily and break it into its component parts. If you are worried about a relationship, the other person's feelings toward you are not within your control, but your own honesty, effort, and consistency within that relationship are. If you are worried about a health diagnosis, the underlying biology is not within your control, but your adherence to treatment, your lifestyle choices, and your attitude toward the process are. Almost every complex worry, when broken down this way, reveals itself to be a mixture of controllable and uncontrollable elements tangled together, and a significant portion of the distress comes specifically from treating the entire tangled mixture as if it were uniformly within your control or uniformly outside it, rather than doing the more precise work of separating the two and directing your energy only toward the portion that actually responds to effort. A second core principle is negative visualization, an exercise the Stoics used deliberately and one that sounds counterintuitive until you understand its actual purpose. Rather than avoiding thoughts of loss or difficulty, the Stoics recommended briefly and deliberately imagining the loss of things you currently value: your health, your relationships, your possessions, your position, not to induce anxiety, but to interrupt the dangerous human tendency to take everything for granted until it is gone. This practice accomplishes two things simultaneously. It builds gratitude for what you currently have by making its impermanence vivid rather than abstract, and it reduces the shock and devastation of eventual loss because some degree of mental preparation has already occurred in advance. This is not the same as anxious, chronic worry about worst-case scenarios, which is unfocused and repetitive and produces only dread. Negative visualization is a brief, deliberate, controlled exercise, perhaps a few minutes at most, undertaken with clear intention, and then set aside. And the difference between these two practices, worry and visualization, is the difference between drowning in an emotion and briefly, purposefully visiting it before returning to a grounded, present state. A practical way to begin using this tool is during an ordinary, unremarkable moment, not during a crisis when your nervous system is already activated and poorly positioned to extract the intended benefit. While having an easy conversation with someone you love, briefly and gently allow yourself to consider that this specific moment, this exact conversation, will not be available forever, that time with this person is finite in a way that is easy to intellectually acknowledge and remarkably easy to functionally forget in the routine of daily life. Notice how this brief consideration changes your presence in that exact moment, often producing a small, immediate increase in attentiveness and warmth that would not have been there otherwise. This is the entire mechanism working in real time, not as a morbid preoccupation with loss, but as a tool that sharpens appreciation for what remains present specifically because its impermanence has been made momentarily visible rather than left comfortably invisible. A third principle, and one directly relevant to the identity work covered earlier in this audiobook, is the idea that your reaction to events, not the events themselves, determines your experience of them. This is often summarized in the observation that people are disturbed not by events, but by their judgments concerning events. Two people can lose the exact same amount of money in a poor investment, and one will be consumed by weeks of self-recrimination and anxiety, while the other absorbs the loss, extracts whatever lesson is available, and moves forward within days. The external event was identical. The internal judgment attached to it was entirely different, and that judgment, not the event, produced the difference in suffering. This does not mean events do not matter or that all outcomes are equally desirable. It simply means that a significant portion of your suffering in response to any given event is generated internally through interpretation, rather than being an unavoidable, fixed consequence of the event itself. And that internal portion is precisely the part you have genuine power to influence. Finally, the Stoics placed enormous emphasis on the concept of virtue as the only true good, meaning that character, integrity, courage, and wisdom were considered the only things genuinely worth pursuing for their own sake, while external outcomes like wealth, reputation, and even health were considered preferable, but ultimately outside your full control, and therefore not a sound foundation to build your sense of worth upon. Applied to modern life, this translates into a powerful reframe for measuring your own days. Instead of evaluating whether today was good or bad based entirely on external outcomes, whether you got the promotion, whether the relationship worked out, whether the message received a reply, evaluate your days based on whether you acted with integrity, discipline, and courage given the circumstances you were actually facing. This standard is available to you every single day regardless of external conditions, which makes it an extraordinarily stable foundation for self-respect, one that does not rise and fall with the unpredictable tide of results that were never fully within your control to begin with. It is worth adding one final grounding note to this chapter. None of these principles ask you to become emotionally distant or indifferent to your own life. The Stoics were frequently misunderstood, both in their own time and today, as advocating for a cold, detached existence. And this misreading has caused real harm, feeding directly back into the false version of mental strength dismantled back in Chapter 2. The actual Stoic texts, when read honestly, describe people who loved deeply, grieved genuinely, and cared intensely about their families, their work, and their communities. What they refused to do was let circumstances entirely outside their control dictate the quality of their inner life or the integrity of their actions. That is not coldness. That is the exact same distinction between feeling fully and being governed by feeling that has run through this entire audiobook from the very first chapter, arriving here thousands of years later. In the words of philosophers who understood something about the human mind that remains just as true today as it was then. Chapter 13. Protecting your energy from other people. No matter how much internal work you do not exist in isolation. You move through a world full of other people, and some of those people, whether through their own unresolved pain their own negativity, or simply incompatible values will consistently drain your emotional resources if you do not learn how to protect yourself deliberately. This chapter is about recognizing these dynamics clearly and building practical strategies to remain grounded, even when surrounded by people who are not. The first step is recognizing the specific patterns that consistently drain emotional energy. Because most people experience the drain without ever clearly identifying its source, which leaves them feeling exhausted without understanding why. Chronic complainers, people who process every conversation through a lens of grievance without ever moving towards solutions or acceptance, will slowly pull your own mood downward if you consistently absorb their negativity as your own responsibility to fix or share. Comparison-driven people, who subtly or overtly measure their worth against yours and communicate in ways designed to elevate themselves at your expense, will chip away at your confidence if you engage with their framing instead of recognizing it for what it is. And energy takers, people who consistently need emotional labor, reassurance, or crisis management from you without ever reciprocating that same support, will leave you depleted over time, even though no single interaction with them feels dramatic in isolation. None of this means these people are necessarily bad or malicious. Many of them are simply operating from their own unaddressed patterns, the exact same kind covered throughout this audiobook, just applied to someone else's life instead of your own. Understanding this does not obligate you to fix it for them, but it does allow you to interact with more clarity and considerably less personal reactivity. There is a fourth pattern worth naming specifically, because it is often the hardest to recognize, precisely because it does not look negative on the surface at all. And that is the chronic minimizer, someone who consistently responds to your genuine excitement or accomplishments with subtle deflation, whether through indifference, immediate one-upping, or quietly changing the subject. This pattern is corrosive specifically because it is difficult to point to any single instance as clearly wrong. Each individual occurrence seems small enough to dismiss, and yet the cumulative effect over months of sharing good news, only to have it consistently met with muted or diverted responses, teaches you, slowly and almost invisibly, to stop sharing altogether, which is its own significant loss. Pay attention to which relationships in your life consistently receive your genuine enthusiasm well, meeting it with real interest and warmth, and which relationships consistently, if subtly, dampen it. And let that awareness inform how much of your authentic excitement you continue extending toward each one. The second step is what can be called the observer stance, a practice of consciously stepping back from a draining interaction while it is happening, rather than only reflecting on it afterward. When you notice someone launching into their third complaint of the conversation, or subtly diminishing something you accomplished, silently shift into an observer role. Notice the pattern as information about them rather than as a verdict about you or an obligation you must immediately absorb and resolve. This is not the same as becoming cold or uncaring. You can still listen, still respond with warmth, still offer support where appropriate. What changes is that you stop merging their emotional state with your own automatically. The exact same separation practiced in Chapter 3 between yourself and your own emotions, now extended outward, to protect you from unconsciously adopting other people's emotional states as if they were your own, simply because you were standing nearby when they occurred. This observer stance is particularly valuable in situations you cannot simply exit. A family gathering, a workplace you depend on for income, a shared living situation where physically removing yourself from a draining person is not a realistic option in the way it might be with a casual acquaintance. In these unavoidable situations, the observer stance becomes your primary tool of self-protection because it allows you to remain physically present while withdrawing the specific kind of emotional merger that causes the draining effect in the first place. Practice this by silently narrating what you are observing as it happens, almost like a quiet internal commentary running alongside the interaction. This person is expressing frustration about their situation. I notice an urge to absorb that frustration as my own responsibility. I am choosing to remain present and kind without taking on that weight myself. This internal narration, done silently and without any change in your outward warmth toward the person, creates exactly the kind of psychological distance that allows you to remain in difficult, unavoidable relationships without being slowly worn down by them over months and years of continued proximity. The third step involves being deliberate about the ratio of energy-giving and energy-receiving relationships in your life. This does not mean every relationship needs to be perfectly transactional or that you should abandon anyone going through a difficult period. Genuine support during hard times is one of the most valuable things relationships provide. And reciprocity should be measured across the full arc of a relationship rather than in any single conversation. What it does mean is paying honest attention to whether certain relationships are consistently, chronically one-directional over long periods of time, months and years rather than a single hard season, with you providing steady emotional labor and rarely receiving anything comparable in return. If you identify a relationship like this, the goal is not necessarily to end it, though sometimes that is the healthiest option, but at minimum to consciously reduce the amount of unreciprocated energy you continue investing, and to actively cultivate other relationships in your life where the exchange runs in both directions so that your overall emotional ecosystem is not perpetually operating at a deficit. There is also a subtler drain worth naming directly, because it does not come from any single difficult person, but from constant, low-grade exposure to negativity through screens rather than face-to-face relationships. The content you consume, endless streams of outrage, comparison, and manufactured urgency, functions the exact same way a draining person does, except it operates continuously, in the background, often without you consciously registering its cumulative effect, the way you would notice a single draining conversation. Treat your information diet with the same deliberate boundaries described in Chapter 7. Notice which accounts, feeds, or shows consistently leave you feeling more anxious, more comparison-driven, or more cynical after consuming them, and apply the exact same discernment to them that you would apply to a person exhibiting the same effect on your emotional state. Protecting your energy in the modern world is no longer only about the people physically around you. It is equally about the constant stream of digital input most people never think to audit at all. Finally, understand that protecting your energy is not selfish. Despite how it may have been framed to you by people who benefited from your previous lack of boundaries around it, you cannot pour from an empty container, and every ounce of energy you spend absorbing negativity you did not create and cannot resolve is energy unavailable for your own growth, your own relationships that actually nourish you, and your own capacity to show up as the resilient, grounded person this entire audiobook has been building toward. Protecting your energy is not withdrawal from the world. It is the precondition for being able to remain genuinely present and generous with the people and pursuits that actually deserve that version of you, rather than arriving to them already depleted by everything and everyone else you failed to filter along the way. Chapter 14. Making Strength a Permanent Way of Life. Everything covered across the previous 13 chapters can produce a genuine and noticeable transformation over the coming weeks and months. But transformation achieved is not the same as transformation sustained, and this chapter exists specifically to address the single biggest reason people build real mental strength and then quietly lose it again over the following year: the absence of a long-term maintenance structure. Motivation. The feeling that carried you through the early stages of this work is not a reliable long-term fuel source. It fluctuates, fades, and eventually disappears, regardless of how committed you currently feel while listening to this. What replaces motivation for anyone who sustains real change permanently is structure. And this final practical chapter is about building that structure before your current motivation runs out. The first element of permanent maintenance is what can be called your minimum viable practice. The smallest possible version of everything you have learned that you commit to doing even on your worst days, when energy, time, and willpower are all in short supply. This is critical because the version of this work you can sustain during a calm, well-rested week is not the version that determines whether the change lasts. What determines permanence is whether you have a stripped-down version simple enough to maintain during the weeks when life falls apart, when you are exhausted, overwhelmed, or in crisis, because those are precisely the weeks when old patterns are most likely to resurface. And they are also the weeks when an ambitious daily practice is most likely to be abandoned entirely rather than simply scaled down. Define this minimum version explicitly right now. It might be as small as one conscious breath before reacting to anything difficult, and nothing else. On good weeks, you will do considerably more than this minimum. On terrible weeks, this minimum alone is enough to keep the thread from breaking completely. And an unbroken thread, however thin, is infinitely easier to rebuild from than a thread that has been severed entirely. Think of this minimum viable practice the same way emergency responders think about a minimum viable plan during a crisis. Not the ideal, comprehensive response they would execute under perfect conditions, but the smallest set of actions that keeps the situation from deteriorating further until more resources become available. Your worst weeks are not the time to expect your best self to show up in full. They are the time to protect the floor, the absolute baseline below which you refuse to fall, so that when the crisis passes and your resources return, you are rebuilding from that floor, rather than from a much deeper hole created by weeks of complete abandonment of everything you have built. Many people unconsciously treat difficult weeks as an all-or-nothing proposition, either full practice or none at all. And it is precisely this false binary that turns a single hard week into a months-long relapse. Removing that binary, by explicitly defining and honoring a genuine minimum, is one of the single most protective structures you can put in place. The second element is periodic recalibration. Set a recurring reminder, perhaps once a month, to briefly revisit the core ideas from this audiobook, not by re-listening to the entire thing every time, but simply by reviewing your own notes, your evidence log from Chapter 10, or your after-action reviews from Chapter 8. Human beings drift. Even genuinely transformed people slowly, unconsciously slide back toward old defaults over months and years, if nothing interrupts that drift periodically. This is not a sign of failure or of the work not having taken hold. It is simply how minds work, shaped constantly by whatever inputs and repetitions are currently active, and if new inputs stop reinforcing the identity you built, older, more deeply grooved patterns will gradually reassert themselves by default. A monthly check-in, however brief, is a small investment that prevents years of quiet erosion. The third element is community. And this deserves direct acknowledgement because so much of the self-improvement world implies that this kind of transformation is a purely solo endeavor, achieved through private discipline alone. In practice, people who sustain deep change over years almost always have some form of ongoing accountability or connection, whether that is a close friend who understands this work and checks in honestly, a therapist or coach who provides outside perspective, or a community of people pursuing similar growth who normalize both the struggle and the progress involved. Isolation makes drift invisible because there is no external mirror reflecting back to you when old patterns are quietly creeping back in. Connection provides that mirror. This does not require a formal program or structured group, though those can certainly help. It simply requires being honest with at least one other person about the fact that you are actively doing this work, so that person can, even informally, notice and name it if they see you sliding backward before you notice it yourself. If you currently cannot identify a single person in your life you would feel comfortable being this honest with, treat that discovery as useful information rather than as a discouraging dead end. It simply means that alongside the internal work covered throughout this audiobook, building or deepening at least one relationship capable of holding this kind of honesty is itself a worthwhile goal to add to your minimum viable practice going forward. This does not need to happen immediately or all at once. It might start as small as sharing one honest sentence about your own struggle with someone who has shown themselves to be trustworthy in smaller ways, and gradually deepening that honesty as trust is established. Many people discover, once they actually attempt this, that far more people in their life are willing to hold this kind of conversation than they assumed, because most people are quietly navigating similar struggles themselves and are often relieved when someone else opens the door to a more honest exchange than the surface-level interactions that otherwise dominate daily social life. The fourth element is redefining what setbacks in this specific journey mean, because you will have them, and how you interpret them determines whether they become permanent regressions or simply temporary dips in an otherwise upward trajectory. A week where you handled everything with old, reactive patterns instead of the tools built throughout this audiobook is not evidence that the transformation failed or was never real. It is simply a difficult week, the same as any other setback covered in Chapter 8, deserving the exact same after-action review rather than a global verdict on your character or your capacity for change. The people who maintain this work permanently are not the people who never have a difficult week. They are the people who, after a difficult week, return to their minimum viable practice the following Monday without treating the lapse as proof that none of it was ever real, and that single choice, to return rather than to abandon, repeated indefinitely over years, is the entire difference between temporary improvement and permanent transformation. There is a fifth and final element worth adding to this maintenance structure, and it concerns how you handle your own success once it starts to show. Somewhat counterintuitively, sustained success at this work introduces its own quiet risk, complacency. Once triggers stop firing as intensely, once old patterns have faded into the background for months at a time, it becomes tempting to assume the work is finished and the daily practices are no longer necessary. This is precisely the mindset that precedes the most significant relapses, because the practices themselves are often what kept the patterns dormant in the first place. And removing them does not preserve the progress. It simply removes the maintenance that was sustaining it. Treat this work the way you would treat physical fitness, rather than a course with a defined endpoint. Nobody who achieves a strong level of physical fitness concludes that exercise is no longer necessary because they finally got in shape. The strength remains only for as long as the practice maintaining it continues. And the same is true, without exception, for the emotional and mental strength built across every chapter of this audiobook. Chapter 15. The choice that changes everything. We have covered an enormous amount of ground together, where emotional weakness actually comes from, and why it was never a fixed part of who you are. What mental strength actually means, and why it has almost nothing to do with feeling less. A complete reprogramming sequence you can apply to any difficult emotion for the rest of your life. The trap of the victim mindset and how to reclaim responsibility without denying real injustice. The daily disciplines that turn insight into an actual trained reflex. How to handle triggers, criticism, and setbacks without collapsing. How to build boundaries that protect your energy without becoming a wall against genuine connection. How confidence is actually built from the ground up, through evidence rather than manufactured belief. Ancient wisdom that has helped human beings remain steady under pressure for thousands of years before any of this had modern scientific language attached to it. How to protect yourself from the people around you who quietly drain what you have worked so hard to build. And finally, the structures required to make all of this permanent rather than a temporary phase that fades once the initial motivation of listening to this wears off. None of it means anything without one final ingredient. And that ingredient is the decision made right now, in this moment, to actually begin. There is a specific and very human trap waiting at the end of every piece of transformative content. Like this one. The trap of feeling inspired, feeling like something has shifted internally, and then closing this out, returning to ordinary life, and slowly letting the feeling fade without ever converting it into a single concrete action. Understanding everything in this audiobook intellectually will change absolutely nothing about your life if it stops at understanding. The gap between the people who listen to material like this and stay exactly the same, and the people who listen to it and genuinely transform their lives has never been a gap in intelligence, information, or even motivation in that first inspired moment. It has always, without exception, been a gap in action taken in the hours and days immediately following, before the feeling fades and ordinary life reasserts its familiar pull. It is worth being honest about why this gap exists so consistently, because understanding the mechanism makes it considerably easier to avoid falling into it yourself. Inspiration. The feeling you may be experiencing right now is itself a temporary, emotional state, no different in its underlying nature from any of the emotions covered throughout the earlier chapters of this audiobook. It arrives with genuine intensity, and like every emotion, it fades on its own timeline. Whether or not you act on it. Most people unconsciously wait for this feeling to translate itself into changed behavior automatically, as though motivation were a fuel tank that, once filled, would simply carry them forward on its own. It does not work this way, and it never has. The feeling of inspiration is not the mechanism of change. It is simply the doorway. Walking through it requires a separate, deliberate action, taken while the doorway is still open. Because the doorway itself does not remain open indefinitely, and once it closes, the return to ordinary momentum happens quickly and quietly, often within hours rather than days. So here is what actually happens next. And it does not require you to implement all 15 chapters simultaneously starting tomorrow, which would be a recipe for overwhelm and eventual abandonment. It requires one single, specific action, chosen right now, before you move on to whatever comes next in your day. Choose one tool from everything covered: the naming and separation sequence from Chapter 3, the after-action review from Chapter 8, the third-person test for your inner critic from Chapter 9, the minimum viable practice from Chapter 14. Whichever one landed most powerfully for you personally as you listened. Commit to using that single tool the very next time an appropriate moment arises, which, realistically, based on how life works, will likely be sometime in the next 24 hours. Not eventually. Not once you feel ready. The next time, consider, for a moment, everything that had to already be true for you to have made it this far. You had to be willing to look honestly at patterns most people spend their entire lives avoiding. You had to sit with chapters that were, at times, uncomfortable. Chapters that challenged identities you may have quietly held about yourself for years. That willingness is not nothing. It is, in fact, the exact same quality that will carry you through the harder, less glamorous work of actually applying what you have learned. The daily reps, the imperfect attempts, the setbacks that will inevitably come and that you now know how to interpret correctly instead of catastrophically. You already possess the core trait required for this transformation to succeed, because you demonstrated it simply by staying present through all 15 chapters of material that asked more of you than passive entertainment ever does. Every version of you that has ever existed was built the exact same way every other human transformation in history has been built, not through a single dramatic moment of change, but through the accumulation of ordinary, repeated choices, made consistently, over time, most of which felt unremarkable while they were happening. The emotionally weak patterns you may have struggled with were built this way, through years of small, repeated moments. The strength described throughout this entire audiobook is built the exact same way, through small, repeated moments, except now you are choosing them deliberately instead of falling into them by default. You do not need to become a fundamentally different person overnight, and you never will, because that is simply not how change works for anyone. You need to become, today, in this one next moment, someone who chooses the deliberate response instead of the automatic one single time. Then again tomorrow, then again the day after that. That is the entire mechanism. That is the entire path. There is nothing more complicated hiding behind it. No secret you have not already been given across these 15 chapters. The only thing left standing between the person you have been and the person described at the very beginning of this audiobook, the version of you that does not flinch, that stands back up quickly that navigates by values instead of by passing emotional weather, is the choice to begin. Make it now.